Part 1: The Silence of the Mountain. There is a mountain in northern China called Mount Skull. That is not a poetic name. It is not a metaphor. For over 2,000 years, the bones of the dead have been washing out of its soil. Every heavy rain, every spring thaw, another layer of skeletons emerges from the earth. Farmers plowing their fields have found skulls crushed by stones. Shepherds grazing their flocks have stumbled upon mass graves so vast that the bodies were stacked like firewood. The mountain is haunted, not by ghosts, but by history. A history so violent, so catastrophic, so utterly annihilating that it changed the course of Chinese civilization and left a scar on the landscape that has never healed. This is the site of the Battle of Changping, fought in the year 260 BC, the bloodiest single battle of the ancient world, a battle that lasted for over 2 years, a battle that ended not with a surrender, not with a treaty, not with a retreat, but with the systematic execution of 400,000 human beings, 400,000 men, buried alive, beheaded, slain in the fields and ravines until the rivers ran red and the ground was soft with blood. It was a massacre so complete that the state that lost the battle, the state of Zhao, never recovered. An entire generation of its men was erased from existence in a single afternoon of slaughter. And the general who ordered the killing, a man named Bai Qi, became the most feared and reviled military commander in Chinese history. His name, for 2 millennia, has been a synonym for ruthless, calculating, merciless violence. Today, we are going to walk onto that battlefield. We are going to stand in the cold autumn of 260 BC, on the plains and mountains of Changping, and we are going to watch as 2 of the great powers of ancient China, the Qin and the Zhao, tear each other apart in a struggle for the future of an empire. This is not just a story of swords and chariots, it is a story of grand strategy and terrible mistakes, of pride that led to ruin, of a young king who refused to listen to reason, of an old general who was replaced by a fool, of a military genius who trapped an entire army and then, faced with the impossible problem of what to do with 400,000 prisoners of war, made a choice that echoes down the centuries. The Battle of Changping is the battle that created China, and to understand how, we have to go back to the beginning, to an age of endless war. 5040. Part 2: The Warring States, a World of Blood. To understand the Battle of Changping, you have to understand the world it was fought in. The period we are talking about is called the Warring States period. It lasted for over 200 years, from roughly 475 BC to 221 BC, and it was one of the most brutal, chaotic, and transformative epochs in human history. Imagine a continent divided into 7 major kingdoms: Qin in the west, Zhao in the north, Wei in the center, Han in the south, Yan in the northeast, Qi in the east, Chu in the southeast. Each of these kingdoms had its own army, its own currency, its own writing system, its own culture, its own king, and its own ambition. And for 2 centuries, they fought each other in a never-ending series of wars. Alliances were made and broken, treaties were signed and ignored, armies marched back and forth across the central plains, burning cities, massacring populations, and redrawing borders in blood. This was not a world of chivalry, this was a world of total war. The old aristocratic code of conduct, where nobles fought nobles and chariots according to strict rules of honor, had been swept away. In its place was a new kind of warfare: mass conscription, professional generals, ruthless tactics. The goal was no longer to gain glory. The goal was to annihilate the enemy, to destroy his ability to ever fight again. The armies of the warring states were enormous by ancient standards. The old Zhou dynasty, which had nominally ruled over all of China, had fielded armies of maybe 10 or 20,000 men. The warring states could put hundreds of thousands of soldiers into the field. The state of Qin, in particular, had transformed itself into a military machine of terrifying efficiency. The Qin were the westernmost of the kingdoms, occupying the Wei River Valley in what is now Shaanxi province. For centuries, they had been considered semi-barbarians by the more cultured states of the Central Plains. Their land was harsh, their customs were rough, their contact with the non-Chinese peoples of the steppe had made them harder, tougher, and more adaptable than their rivals. And in the 4th century BC, they had undergone a revolution. The legalist reforms of Xiangyang had turned Qin into a totalitarian state organized entirely for war. Every aspect of Qin society was geared towards the production of soldiers and grain. The population was organized into mutually responsible groups that would be punished collectively for the failures of any individual. The nobility was stripped of its hereditary privileges and replaced with a system of ranks based purely on military merit. A Qin soldier who brought back the head of an enemy would be promoted in rank, given land, and exempted from taxes. The result was an army of fanatical, disciplined killers who fought not just for their state but for their own personal advancement. The other kingdoms feared Qin. They were right to. The state of Zhao was very different. Zhao occupied the northern territories, straddling the modern provinces of Hebei, Shanxi, and Inner Mongolia. Its people were famous for two things: their cavalry and their stubbornness. Zhao was the northern shield of the Chinese world. Its borders faced the steppe nomads, the Xiongnu and their predecessor, and centuries of fighting against horse archers had made the Zhao military one of the most innovative in the warring states. Qin Wuling of Zhao, who ruled in the late 4th century BC, had carried out a famous military reform, forcing his soldiers to adopt the clothing and tactics of the nomads. They wore trousers instead of robes. They rode horses and shot bows from the saddle. This was a radical break with Chinese tradition, which had always centered on chariots and massed infantry, but it worked. Zhao became a military powerhouse. Its cavalry was the finest in the warring states. Its soldiers were tough, proud, and fiercely loyal to their homeland. Zhao was not as rich as Kai, not as populous as Chu, not as disciplined as Qin, but it was a warrior state, and it was determined to never be conquered. By 260 BC, the two powers were on a collision course. Qin had been expanding for decades, swallowing up territory from its weaker neighbors. Zhao stood in its way. If Qin could defeat Zhao, the road to unification would be open. If Zhao could stop Qin, the balance of power might be preserved. The spark that ignited the war came from a small dispute over a piece of territory called Shandong. Shandong was a mountainous region in modern-day southern Shanxi. It was originally part of the state of Han, a minor kingdom that Qin had already beaten into submission. In 262 BC, the Qin army attacked Han and cut off Shandong from the rest of Han territory. The governor of Shandong, facing certain defeat, made a fateful decision. Instead of surrendering to Qin, he offered to give Shandong to Zhao. This was a huge gamble. Accepting Shandong would mean war with Qin, but Shandong was a strategic prize. It controlled the approaches to the Zhao heartland. Whoever held Shandong held the high ground. The Xiao Qi, Xie Cheng, consulted his advisor. Some urged caution. Do not provoke Qin. Let them have Shandong. It is not worth a war. Others urged boldness. Shandong is a gift. Seize it. Defend it. Show Qin that Zhao will not be pushed around. The king was young. He was ambitious. He wanted to prove himself. He accepted the offer. Qin was furious. The great war machine of the West began to mobilize. The stage was set for the bloodiest battle of the ancient world. 14-0-24-0. Part 3. The armies gather. Qin and Zhao face off. The Qin army that marched east in 262 BC was led by a general named Wang He. He was a competent, experienced commander, a product of the Qin military system. His orders were to take Shandong by force and punish Zhao for its arrogance. The Zhao army sent to meet him was commanded by a veteran general named Lian Po. Lian Po was one of the most famous soldiers of his age. He was old, grizzled, and wise. He had fought battles from the steppe to the Yellow River. He understood something that the young king in the Zhao capital did not. Qin was not an enemy you defeated in a single, glorious battle. Qin was an enemy you had to outlast. The Qin army was a sledgehammer. It was designed for offensive warfare, for rapid marches and decisive engagements. Its soldiers were driven by the incentive system. They wanted to fight. They wanted heads. Lian Po looked at the situation and made a strategic decision that would define the early phase of the war. He would not fight. He would not give the Qin the decisive battle they craved. Instead, he would build. Lian Po constructed a series of fortified camps across the Changping region, a network of walls, trenches, and defensive positions that stretched for miles across the mountains and valleys. He positioned his forces on the high ground, in positions that were almost impossible to assault. He dug in, and he waited. The Qin army arrived and found itself facing a wall of earth, stone, and spearmen. Wang He launched probing attacks. They were repulsed. He launched larger assaults. They were repulsed with heavy losses. The Qin soldiers, for all their ferocity, could not break the Zhao lines. Lian Po's strategy was working. He was bleeding the Qin army of men, supplies, and, most importantly, time. The Qin expeditionary force was hundreds of miles from its home base. Every day it spent sitting in front of the Zhao fortifications was a day its supply lines stretched thinner. Every day, the cost of the war mounted. Every day, Lian Po grew stronger and his enemy grew weaker. This was the strategy of a master. It was not glamorous. It did not produce heroic charges or dramatic victories, but it was effective. The Qin commanders knew they were in trouble. They could not break through. They could not outflank the Zhao positions because Lian Po had fortified every pass and every valley. They could not starve him out because he had stockpiled supplies and protected his supply lines. They were stuck, and the longer they stayed stuck, the worse their situation became. Back in the Qing capital of Xinjiang, Qing Zhejiang was growing impatient. He was an old man now, in his 60s, and he had spent his entire reign expanding the power of Qing. He was not accustomed to failure. He summoned his chief minister, a brilliant and ruthless man named Fan Zhu, and demanded a solution. Fan Zhu was a master of intrigue. He understood that wars were not always won on the battlefield. Sometimes, they were won in the corridors of power. He proposed a plan so subtle and so devastating that it would destroy the Zhao army without Qin having to fire a single arrow. Fan Zhu sent spies into the Zhao kingdom. These spies carried gold, lots of gold, and they began to spread a rumor. The rumor was simple. General Lian Po is old. He is afraid. He hides behind his walls because he is too scared to fight. But there is another Zhao general, a young, brilliant commander named Zhao Qiu. He is the son of a famous warrior. He understands modern warfare. If he were in command, he would crush the Qin army in a single, glorious battle. The rumor spread. It reached the court of the Zhao Qing, and the king, who was already frustrated with Lian Po's cautious strategy, who was spending enormous sums of money on a war that seemed to have no end, who was being whispered to by his own advisors who were perhaps also on the Qin payroll, began to believe. He summoned Lian Po and ordered him to stop hiding and fight. Lian Po refused. He explained, patiently, that to abandon the fortifications and attack the Qin army on open ground would be suicide. The king did not want to hear it. He wanted a victory. He wanted glory. He fired Lian Po, and he appointed Zhao Qiu, the young, brilliant, utterly inexperienced son of a famous father, as the new commander of the Zhao army. It was a decision that would doom 400,000 men to their graves. 24-0-34-0. Part 4. The trap is set. Bai Qi takes command. The Qin had won the first phase of the battle, not with swords, but with spies. The Zhao king had done exactly what they wanted. He had replaced a wise and cautious veteran with an arrogant young fool. But the king were not finished. They had another move to make, a move that would turn a Zhao defeat into a Zhao annihilation. In secret, the Qin High Command replaced their general, Wang Yi, the competent but uninspired commander who had been stalemated by Lian Po, was sent home. In his place, the king appointed a man whose name would become legend. Bai Qi was the greatest general of the Warring States period, perhaps the greatest general in all of Chinese history. He was a machine of death. Over the course of his career, he had fought over 70 major battles. He had never lost a single one. He had conquered dozens of cities. He had destroyed entire armies. The records say that the number of soldiers killed under his command exceeded 1 million. In an era of total war, Bai Qi was the ultimate weapon, and he had been waiting for this moment. The king kept Bai Qi's appointment an absolute secret. They spread false information that Wang He was still in command. They did not want the Zhao to know that the master of annihilation had arrived on the battlefield. Bai Qi arrived at Changping and surveyed the situation. He saw the Zhao fortifications, now manned by soldiers under a new, aggressive commander. He saw the terrain, a maze of mountains, valleys, and narrow passes, and he formulated a plan so perfect, so coldly logical, and so utterly merciless that it would be studied in military academies for 2,000 years. Bai Qi's plan was based on a single insight. The new Zhao commander, Zhao Qiu, wanted to fight. He was young. He was proud. He had been appointed to win a glorious victory, not to sit behind walls. If Bai Qi could convince Zhao Qiu that the Qin army was vulnerable, that a bold attack could shatter it, Zhao Qiu would come out of his fortifications and commit his entire army to an offensive. And once he did, Bai Qi would spring his trap. The Qin army was divided into 3 main forces. The first force, positioned directly in front of the Zhao lines, would engage the enemy and then, at the critical moment, execute a feigned retreat. They would pretend to break. They would run. They would draw the Zhao army forward, deeper and deeper into the valley of Changping. The second force, a large detachment of cavalry and light infantry, would remain hidden behind the Qin lines until the Zhao army had fully committed. Then they would swing around and cut the Zhao supply lines, seizing the mountain passes that connected the Zhao army to its base of supplies and reinforcements. The third force, the elite Qin infantry, would be positioned on the high ground on either side of the valley. As the Zhao army advanced, they would allow it to pass, and when the signal was given, they would descend from the heights and attack the Zhao flanks, turning the valley into a killing ground. The Zhao army would be surrounded, cut off from supplies, cut off from retreat. trapped in a valley with no way out. And then, Bai Qi would simply wait. He would not need to storm their positions. He would not need to waste his soldiers' lives. He would let starvation do his work for him. It was a plan of terrifying elegance. And Zhao Qiu, marching confidently out of his fortifications at the head of the largest army Zhao had ever assembled, did not suspect a thing. 34-0-46-0. Part 6. The killing begins. The battle began, as Bai Qi had planned, with a Qin attack. The forward Qin units advanced against the Zhao lines, skirmishing fiercely. Zhao Qiu, seeing the enemy in front of him, did exactly what the Qin expected. He ordered a full-scale assault. The Zhao army, hundreds of thousands of infantry and cavalry, surged forward. The Qin forward units, outnumbered and outmatched, fought for a while and then, in apparent panic, broke and fled. Zhao Qiu saw his opportunity. The enemy was running. Victory was at hand. He ordered his entire army to pursue. The Zhao soldiers, fired with confidence in the promise of glory, chased the retreating Qin forces deeper and deeper into the valley. It was a textbook feigned retreat. The Qin were not running in panic. They were running according to a plan, leading the Zhao army exactly where Bai Qi wanted them. The Zhao army pushed forward, driving the Qin before them, until they had left their own fortifications far behind. The supply wagons, the reserve troops, the support units, all of them were strung out along the narrow mountain roads, struggling to keep up with the rapidly advancing front line. And then, Bai Qi sprang his trap. The hidden Qin cavalry, thousands of horsemen who had been concealed behind the ridges, burst from their hiding places and rode hard for the mountain passes behind the Zhao army. The Zhao supply lines were completely undefended. The Qin cavalry seized the passes, blocked the roads, and cut the Zhao army off from its base. At the same time, the elite Qin infantry on the high ground rose from their concealed positions and attacked the Zhao flanks. The valley erupted in violence. The Zhao army, which had been chasing what it thought was a fleeing enemy, suddenly found itself being attacked from all sides. Panic spread through the ranks. Soldiers who had been advancing in confidence now looked around and saw only enemies. The Qin were everywhere, on the ridges above them, in the passes behind them. The retreating Qin forward units turned around and counterattacked. The Zhao army was trapped. Zhao Qiu, the young general who had been so eager for glory, realized what had happened. He had been tricked. He had led his entire army into a trap, and now, there was no way out. Bai Qi did not order an immediate assault on the surrounded Zhao forces. That would have been costly. The Zhao army was still huge, still dangerous, still capable of fighting with the desperation of cornered men. Instead, Bai Qi did something far more terrifying. He built his own fortifications, facing inward, encircling the Zhao army in a ring of walls and trenches. The hunter had become a caged animal. The Zhao army was now trapped in a valley, surrounded by a fortified enemy, with no food, no supplies, and no hope of reinforcement. Bai Qi's troops did not need to attack. They just needed to wait. The Zhao army began to starve. 46-0-58-0. Part 7. The Long Death. 46 Days of Hell. What followed was one of the most horrific episodes in military history. The Zhao army, 400,000 men, was trapped in the Changping Valley for 46 days. Let me describe what that means. 400,000 men. Imagine the entire population of a major modern city, crammed into a narrow valley, with no food, no clean water, and no shelter. The first thing that ran out was food. The Zhao supply train had been cut off on the first day of the battle. The soldiers had been carrying a few days' rations in their packs. Within a week, those were gone. They began to eat their horses. The Zhao cavalry, the finest horsemen in the warring states, slaughtered their mounts and ate them raw, desperate for any sustenance. The horses did not last long. After the horses, they ate anything they could find: grass, tree bark, leather from their armor and boots, insects, rats. Eventually, they began to eat each other. The historical records are explicit and horrifying. Sima Qian, the great historian of the Han Dynasty, writing about a century after the battle, records that the trapped Zhao soldiers secretly killed and ate the weak and the wounded. This was not a breakdown of discipline. This was the logical, inevitable consequence of 46 days without food. The human body, pushed to the absolute limit of starvation, will do whatever it takes to survive. The Zhao army, trapped in that valley, descended into a nightmare of cannibalism, disease, and despair. The valley stank of death. The wounded lay where they fell, too weak to move, slowly dying of hunger and infection. The Qin, surrounding them on all sides, could hear the screams and moans of the dying. They did nothing. This was part of Bai Qi's plan. The longer the Zhao army starved, the weaker it became. The weaker it became, the easier it would be to destroy when the time came. The Zhao army attempted multiple breakouts. Each one was a desperate, hopeless assault against fortified positions held by fresh, well-fed king troops. Each one failed. The Zhao soldiers, weakened by hunger, could barely lift their weapons. They stumbled towards the Qin lines and were cut down by archers and spearmen. Their bodies piled up in the narrow passes, creating walls of dead flesh that blocked the escape routes. Bai Qi, the young commander, led one of these breakout attempts himself. He charged at the head of his best remaining troops, a suicide charge of desperate men. He was killed by Qin archers. His body was never recovered. The Zhao army was now leaderless, starving, and doomed. Inside the Qin camp, Bai Qi watched and waited. He was not a sadist. He did not enjoy the suffering of the Zhao soldiers. He was a professional. He was waiting until the moment when the Zhao army was so weak that his troops could slaughter them with minimal risk. That moment came after 46 days. 58-0-68-0. Part 8. The day of the massacre. On the 47th day, Bai Qi gave the order. The Qin army advanced into the valley. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The Zhao soldiers, survivors of 46 days of starvation, were skeletal. They could barely stand. They could not fight. The Qin soldiers moved through the valley systematically, killing everything that moved. They did not bother with swords. Many of the Zhao prisoners were too weak to resist. The Qin simply clubbed them to death or buried them alive. Sima Qian records that the Qin soldiers dug enormous pits and herded the Zhao prisoners into them, covering them with earth while they were still alive. Other Zhao soldiers were beheaded where they stood. The valleys and ravines of Changping were filled with the dead. The official number, recorded in the historical annals, is 400,000 killed. Modern historians have debated this number. Was it really 400,000? Could the ancient world have produced an army that large? Could so many have been killed in a single battle? The archaeological evidence suggests that the number, if not exact, is not far from the truth. The mass graves at Changping, discovered by farmers and excavated by archaeologists, contain hundreds of thousands of skeletons, many of them showing signs of violent death, skulls crushed by blunt instruments, bones with cut marks from swords and axes, bodies buried in mass graves, piled on top of each other without any ritual or respect. The bones are the silent witnesses to the massacre. The number 400,000 has become part of the Chinese historical consciousness. It is a number that carries a weight of horror. Bai Qi, according to the records, did not kill everyone. He released 240 of the youngest Zhao soldiers. He sent them back to the Zhao capital, not as an act of mercy, as a message. He wanted the state of Zhao to know what had happened. He wanted the other kingdoms to know what awaited them if they resisted Qin. The 240 survivors carried the news back to the Zhao heartland. The country was plunged into mourning. Every family in Zhao had lost a father, a son, a brother, a husband. An entire generation of Zhao men had been wiped out in a single afternoon. The state of Zhao would never recover. It limped on for another 30 years. But it was a ghost of its former self, permanently crippled by the loss of its fighting-age male population. The path to Qin's unification of China was now open. 68-0-78-0. Part 9. The aftermath. A nation in mourning. The news of the massacre spread across the warring states like a shockwave. The other kingdoms had seen Qin's ruthlessness before, but nothing on the scale. 400,000 prisoners of war, executed in cold blood. It was a crime against humanity on a scale that the ancient world had never witnessed. The state of Zhao was shattered. The capital, Hinnan, was a city of widows and orphans. The fields lay fallow because there were no men to work them. The walls stood undefended because there were no soldiers to guard them. Zhao had been a great power, the northern bulwark of the Chinese world. Now it was a broken, a leading shell. The other kingdoms reacted with a mixture of horror and self-preservation. They knew that they could not defeat Qin militarily. The only hope was diplomacy, delay, and desperate alliances. But Qin was not interested in peace. The momentum of victory was irresistible. Bai Qi wanted to press the advantage. He urged his king to allow him to march directly on Handan and destroy Zhao entirely. The king, Zhao, hesitated. Perhaps he was shocked by the scale of the killing. Perhaps he was swayed by political considerations. Perhaps he simply believed that Zhao was already dead and there was no need to hurry. He ordered Bai Qi to halt. It was a decision that would create tension between the king and his greatest general. Bai Qi, the man who had never lost a battle, was forced to watch as the opportunity to end the war slipped away. He grew bitter. He feigned illness and refused to lead further campaigns. The king, angered by his general's defiance, eventually ordered Bai Qi to commit suicide. The man who had killed 1,000,000 men died by his own hand, a fittingly grim end for a life soaked in blood. But the death of Bai Qi did not undo the consequences of Changping. The battle had permanently altered the balance of power. Qin was now the undisputed dominant force in the warring states. The other kingdoms, weakened and terrified, could only delay the inevitable. In 230 BC, a new Qin king, Bai Qi, who would later become Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, launched the final campaign of unification. One by one, the remaining kingdoms fell. Han in 230 BC, Gao in 228 BC, Wei in 225 BC, Chu in 223 BC, Yin in 222 BC, Kai in 221 BC. The Warring States period was over. China was unified under the Qin dynasty, and the first emperor, the man who would build the Great Wall and the Terracotta Army, was the grandson of the king who had ordered the massacre at Changping. The blood of Changping had fertilized the soil of the Chinese Empire. The unification of China, one of the most consequential events in world history, was built on the bones of 400,000 Zhao soldiers. This is the dark truth at the heart of Chinese civilization. The great achievements of the Qin dynasty, the standardization of writing, the construction of the roads and canals, the creation of a unified state, all of it rests on a foundation of mass death. The Battle of Changping made the Qin Empire possible, and the Qin Empire made China possible. 780880. Part 10. The Archaeology of Massacre. In 1995, a farmer named Li Shihai was digging a well in his field near the village of Yanglu, in the shadow of Mount Skull. His shovel hit something hard. He thought it was a rock. He dug further and realized it was a skull. Then another. Then another. He had stumbled upon one of the mass graves of Changping. Archaeologists were called in. What they found was staggering. An area of over 30 square kilometers, dotted with mass graves, some containing hundreds of bodies, some containing thousands. The skeletons were jumbled together, bones intertwined, a chaos of violent death. Many of the skulls showed evidence of blunt force trauma, crushed from above as if by clubs or stones. Some skeletons had their hands bound behind their backs. Others were missing limbs, cut away by swords. The archaeologists were looking at the physical remains of the massacre recorded by Sima Qian over 2,000 years earlier. The excavation of Changping continues to this day. Each year, new graves are discovered. Each year, new evidence of the scale and brutality of the battle comes to light. The bones are studied, catalogued, and reburied. But the memory of Changping cannot be buried. The mountain keeps giving up its dead. The question of the number 400,000 continues to be debated. Some scholars argue that it is an exaggeration, that ancient armies could not have been that large, that ancient logistics could not have supported such numbers. Others argue that the number is plausible, that the warring states had populations in the tens of millions, that the conscription systems of the time could mobilize huge armies, that the number of dead includes not just soldiers killed in the battle but also civilians and support personnel. The archaeological evidence cannot give a precise number. The graves are too many, too scattered, too disturbed by centuries of farming and erosion. But the evidence is clear that the massacre was real, that it was enormous, and that it was carried out with a systematic, industrial efficiency that is chilling even by the standards of modern warfare. The legacy of Changping in Chinese culture is complex. Bai Qi is remembered as a monster. His name is used to describe anyone who is ruthlessly, inhumanly violent. The phrase "the killing at Changping" is a shorthand for mass slaughter, but he is also remembered as a military genius. The battle is studied in Chinese military academies as a classic example of encirclement and annihilation. The tension between the horror of what Bai Qi did and the brilliance of how he did it is part of the enduring fascination of Changping. It is a battle that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of war, the limits of loyalty, and the value of human life. Bai Qi made a choice. He could have taken the Zhao soldiers prison. He could have tried to integrate them into the Qin army or release them in small groups to weaken Zhao's will to resist. But he chose to kill them. He calculated, coldly, and rationally, that 400,000 dead Zhao soldiers were less dangerous than 400,000 living Zhao soldiers who might one day rebel. He was probably right, from a purely strategic perspective. The massacre at Changping broke Zhao's back and made Qing's unification of China inevitable. But the moral cost of that calculation is beyond measure. 880980. Part 11. The Echoes of Changping. How the battle shaped China. The Battle of Changping did not just destroy an army. It reshaped the course of Chinese history. The Qin unification of China in 221 BC was the direct result of the military dominance established at Changping. Without the annihilation of the Zhao army, Qin would not have been able to conquer the remaining kingdoms so swiftly and decisively. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, inherited a military machine that had been perfected over generations of warfare, and Changping was the ultimate demonstration of its lethal efficiency. But the legacy of Changping goes deeper than military history. The unification of China under the Qin dynasty created the political and cultural framework that would define Chinese civilization for 2,000 years. The standardization of writing, the creation of a centralized bureaucracy, the construction of the Great Wall, the opening of the Silk Road, all of these flowed from the unified empire that was forged in the fires of the warring states, and Changping was the furnace in which that unification was tempered. Every time you see a Chinese character written, you are seeing a legacy of Changping. Every time you admire the terracotta army, you are admiring a monument built by the descendants of the men who fought at Changping. The battle is woven into the DNA of Chinese civilization. The psychological impact of Changping also shaped the subsequent history of warfare in China. The massacre established a brutal precedent. Prisoners of war could be killed. Surrender did not guarantee survival. This knowledge shaped the behavior of armies and states for centuries. During the wars that followed the collapse of the Qin dynasty, the struggle between Zhou and Han that produced the Han dynasty, commanders knew that defeat might mean annihilation. They fought with the desperation of men who understood what awaited them if they lost. The shadow of Changping hung over every battlefield in Chinese history. In the West, the Battle of Changping is almost completely unknown. We study Cannae, where Hannibal killed 50,000 Romans. We study Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans made a glorious last stand. We study Waterloo, Gettysburg, Stalingrad, but the bloodiest battle of the ancient world, the battle that killed 8 times as many as Cannae, is barely a footnote in Western military history. This is partly due to the long isolation of China from the West, the language barrier, and the Eurocentric focus of our historical education, but it is also due to the nature of the battle itself. Changping does not fit the narrative we like to tell about ancient warfare. It was not a battle of heroes. It was a battle of systems. It was won not by individual courage, but by logistics, intelligence, and cold, calculated slaughter. There is no Leonidas at Changping, no Alexander, no romantic figure to celebrate. There is only Bai Qi, the killing machine, and the 400,000 nameless dead. This is a story that is hard to romanticize, and so we have ignored it. But that is a mistake. Changping is one of the most important battles in human history. It shaped the destiny of a quarter of the world's population. Its echoes are still felt today in the geopolitical realities of East Asia. To understand China, you have to understand Changping. 980160. Part 12: The Lessons of the Skull Mountain. What can we learn from the Battle of Changping? What lessons does it offer to us today, in a world that has not, despite all our progress, left behind the horror of war? The first lesson is about the danger of arrogance. The Zhao king replaced a wise and cautious general with a young and arrogant one because he wanted a glorious victory. He got annihilation. The refusal to listen to experienced counsel, the preference for bold action over patient strategy, the belief that willpower can overcome logistical reality. These are mistakes that military and political leaders continue to make today. The second lesson is about the nature of total war. Changping was not a clash of armies. It was a clash of systems. The Qin war machine, with its legalist ideology, its meritocratic military, its sophisticated logistics, its willingness to use espionage and psychological warfare, was a modern, industrialized killing apparatus operating in the ancient world. The Zhao, brave as they were fighting a different kind of war. The lesson is that military victory goes not to the bravest or the most righteous, but to the side that best mobilizes its resources, organizes its forces, and adapts to the demands of the conflict. The third lesson is about the cost of victory. Bai Qi won the battle, but his victory was so horrific, so morally repugnant, that it haunted him for the rest of his life. He was eventually forced to commit suicide by his own king, a king who had benefited from his crimes but could not tolerate the presence of a man who had become a symbol of inhuman cruelty. The lesson here is that there are victories so costly, so bloody, that they become their own kind of defeat. A victory that requires you to become a monster is a victory that destroys your humanity. The fourth lesson, and perhaps the most important, is about memory. The Battle of Changping was not forgotten. The mountain remembers. The bones remember. The Chinese people remember. The battle has been passed down through oral tradition, through historical texts, through archaeological excavation, through the very name of the landscape. Mount Skull, the place of bone. The refusal to forget is an act of defiance against the erasure of history. The 400,000 dead of Changping are not just statistics. They were human beings. They had names. Families, boas, fairs, they were conscripts. Farmers, sons, fathers. They were marched into a valley and slaughtered like animals, and the mountain refuses to let us forget. Every time it rains, another layer of bones emerges. Every time a farmer digs a well, another mass grave is discovered. The dead are speaking to us across 2,000 years. They are telling us what happened to them, and we have a responsibility to listen, to remember, to ensure that such horrors are never repeated. That is the true legacy of the Battle of Changping, not just a lesson in military strategy. Or warning, a terrible, bloody, bone-strewn warning about what human beings are capable of doing to each other when the restraints of morality are removed and the logic of total war takes hold. 106-110. Part 13. Closing the Valley of Bones. Imagine standing on that mountain today. The sky is clear. The wind rustles through the grass. The valley below is quiet and peaceful. Farmers work the fields. Children play in the villages. It is a scene of ordinary, beautiful, everyday life. And beneath your feet, just a few inches of soil, are the bones of 400,000 men. They lay there still. They have lain there for 23 centuries, waiting for the world to remember them. The Battle of Changping is not just a chapter in a history book. It is a wound in the earth that has never fully healed. It is a reminder that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we like to think, that the most sophisticated cultures are capable of the most primitive violence, that the pursuit of power, unchecked by mercy, leads inexorably to the pile of skulls. The Warring States period ended. The Qin dynasty rose and fell. The Han dynasty rose and lasted for 400 years. Empires came and went. Dynasties bloomed and crumbled. And through all of it, the bones of Changping remain, silent and patient, waiting for someone to tell their story. Today, I have tried to tell that story. I have tried to walk you through the battle, step by step, from the political intrigue in the courts to the slow, agonizing starvation in the valley, to the final, brutal massacre. I have tried to honor the memory of the dead by telling the truth about how they died. It is not a comfortable story. It is not an inspiring story, but it is a true story, and the truth deserves to be told. So, the next time you hear about a great military victory, the next time you hear a politician or general talk about the glory of battle, remember Changping. Remember the Valley of Bones. Remember the mountain that refuses to forget. Remember that every war, no matter how noble the cause, ends in the same place, a field of dead men, a pile of skulls, a silence that stretches on forever. Thank you for watching. If you made it to the end of this long and difficult journey, you have my respect. Please leave a comment. Tell me what you think about Bai Qi's decision. Would you have done differently in his place? Like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. The dead of Changping deserve to be remembered, and now you know their names.